The film, based on true events, begins in 2011. Brian Banks has just played a football game on a college field. Then he receives a call from his parole officer. From now on, people like Brian are required to wear electronic ankle monitors, so the authorities always know where they are. They are also prohibited from coming within 600 meters of any educational institution. He is told he will not be allowed to play college football. And yet, Brian still hoped to make it to the National Football League, a dream he had cherished his entire life, now shattered. Brian can't afford to wait until his parole is over. Who would want him at 27? And with a criminal record, he can't get a decent job. Every time a potential employer finds out he was convicted of a serious crime, they show him the door. Brian hopes to participate in the Innocence Project, a program where a renowned attorney helps exonerate innocent people, even those who have been behind bars for decades. Thousands of letters arrive at the project's office, and somehow, Brian manages to get their attention. Brian served 6 years in prison and has been on parole for 3 years. He grew up in one of the poorest neighborhoods. Football was his escape from crime. By the time he was 16, he was seen as a rising star. Many professional teams had already shown interest in him, but everything changed in the summer of 2002. Brian finally finds a job, and his crew is called to work at a fair. The parole officer reminds him that people with his kind of record have no business being in such places. To avoid going back to jail, Brian is forced to quit. The athlete meets with the director of the Innocence Project, attorney Justin Brooks. Unfortunately, Brian's case can only be reconsidered if he provides new, irrefutable evidence of his innocence. For example, if the girl were to admit she lied 9 years ago. But that's unlikely. She and her mother had sued the school for negligence and won $1.5 million. Still, Brian submits a petition to have the case reopened. A friend promises to help him get permission to work at a local gym. There, Brian meets a trainer named Karina. She offers to train him for free, knowing he can't afford her services. Afterward, they go out for coffee. Karina becomes curious about why he stopped playing football. Brian realizes he needs to be honest with her. When she learns what he was convicted of, Karina's expression changes. She quickly excuses herself and heads back to the gym. At home, Brian finds a letter. The court has denied his request to reopen the case. He starts calling Justin Brooks again. Brooks's assistants want to help the young athlete. They visit Brian and begin asking questions. That day, 16-year-old Brian, then a high school student, ran into a girl named Kanisha during class. She hinted that she was going to the restroom in the school's old building. That spot was often used by couples looking for a quick, private moment, so they went there. At some point, Brian realized he was taking a huge risk. If they got caught, he would be expelled, and his future would be over. He stopped and simply asked Kanisha to leave through the other door. Maybe he needed to choose his words more carefully. But in the end, she was offended, and the next day, she came to school with her mother and the police. They stormed into the Banks house and arrested Brian. The poor guy had already forgotten about the hallway encounter and couldn't understand why this was happening. His mother sold their house and car to hire a lawyer. She advised her son to take a plea deal. Brian should plead guilty in exchange for having the kidnapping and assault charges dropped. Nearly all jurors were white. He wouldn't stand a chance in court anyway. By accepting the plea deal, Brian was supposed to receive a suspended sentence and return to a normal life in just 3 months. The high schooler wasn't even given a chance to discuss it with his mother. He had only 10 minutes to make a decision. Pressured into a corner, Brian agreed to the deal. However, the lawyer miscalculated. Instead of probation, Brian was sentenced to 6 years in prison. He was also placed on a lifetime registry for convicted offenders. Many young lawyers who learned Brian's story volunteered to help him. They interviewed his former classmates, including a girl named Shaylee. Kanisha eventually admitted that nothing had actually happened. She just didn't want her mother to find out she was sleeping with boys. Brian had hoped to get a job at the gym, but the owner still turned him down. Karina later apologized for the way she had reacted. A mutual friend had convinced her that Brian was a good guy who had been falsely accused. Brian met again with attorney Justin. Unfortunately, his case was still at a dead end. Only a very strong, undeniable piece of evidence could overturn it. Justin walked the hallway where Brian had supposedly dragged Kanisha. It would have been impossible. The classroom doors were always open, full of students. Brian went on a date with Karina to a modern art museum. Suddenly, he received a call from his parole officer. He had to leave immediately. A family park was nearby. There was nothing he could do. The athlete dropped Karina off at a stadium and told her about his childhood. He also mentioned Jerome Johnson, a man who helped him keep his sanity in prison. This teacher taught Brian how to survive in a world that didn't care whether he was guilty or not. But everything changed when Brian was transferred to an adult prison. He witnessed a group of Latino inmates stabbing a black man to death. The gang leader then ordered Brian to come to his cell. Brian wrapped a sock around his fist and, once inside, knocked the gang member out with a single punch. It turned out he had broken the inmate's jaw and was sent to solitary confinement for 60 days. During those 2 months, Brian nearly lost his mind. He hallucinated visions of Kenesha, his school coach, and even himself. The only thing that gave him peace was remembering his teacher, Mr. Johnson. Karina eventually opened up and explained why she dropped out of college and reacted the way she did to Brian's confession. She had been harassed by her best friend. Neither the police nor the university helped her. Brian understood why Karina had been so guarded when she found out about his conviction. One day, while Brian was browsing job listings, he suddenly received a friend request from Kenesha Rice. The man jumped in surprise. Kenesha wrote that she had acted like a child back then and now wanted to apologize. Brian fought off his panic and asked her to call him. As it turned out, Kenesha had simply been browsing Facebook and stumbled across Brian's photo. She thought he still looked good. Maybe they could meet up and hang out. She didn't care that he had been in prison or that he still couldn't find work because of her actions. They agreed to meet. Brian's mother tried to talk him out of it. After all, he only had 10 months left on parole. Meeting with the victim was a huge risk. But Brian came up with a plan to use the meeting with Kenesha to his advantage. By that time, the girl had already had 3 children. One of Brian's friends pretended to be a legal consultant and tried to coax a confession from her. He asked Kenesha to recount what had happened. A hidden video camera was recording everything on the table, and Kenesha admitted that Brian hadn't done anything to her. With the recording in hand, Brian rushed to Justin's office. At first, everyone was stunned by such luck, but there was a problem. Kenesha didn't know she was being recorded. That evidence would never be accepted in court in the state of California. It's illegal to record someone without their explicit consent. What's worse, Kenesha would never repeat those words, otherwise she could lose the $1.5 million settlement. Brian was in despair. He had done everything he could and begged Justin, the only man who could help, to do the same. The team returned to his case. They had 10 months left. Otherwise, Brian would forever remain a criminal in the eyes of society. The lawyers drafted a new petition. They also needed to obtain an official statement from Kenesha. Justin met with the prosecutor and proposed a high-profile case that would attract media attention. Raphael agreed to talk to Brian. He had only an hour and a half, so the athlete needed to hurry. But downstairs, Brian was intercepted by his parole officer, who took his car keys. The officer had learned Brian was trying to leave the county, so he searched the vehicle to check for any illegal items. Thanks to Justin, the prosecutor waited for Brian and eventually met with him. Raphael was curious why Kenesha had lied back then. He would never approve a case review without speaking to the victim. Brian realized he had to put pressure on Kenesha, so he called some reporters and gave them the recording of her confession. Soon, the whole country knew Brian's story. He was taking a major risk. Just meeting with the victim could land him back in jail. But the plan worked. Kenesha's mother stormed into the prosecutor's office and caused a scene. Raphael immediately issued a court summons for her. But now Brian had to answer to his parole officer. After all, he had violated his parole conditions. The officer threatened to report the violations, but said he would give Brian 2 months to prove his innocence. 6 weeks later, the hearing finally took place. However, the key witness, Kenesha, never entered the courtroom. She and her mother were loitering in the hallway. The mother had a baby in her arms and was already pregnant with her 4th child. She claimed her daughter was forced to lie on camera for $10,000, even though earlier Kenesha herself had mentioned $20,000. Her statements kept changing, just like they did 11 years ago. Kenesha's mother was asked to leave. Brian's mother nearly lashed out at the shameless liar. Justin asked Kenesha why she didn't just call for help if Brian had really dragged her through the hallway. She replied that she didn't know what was going to happen. She just wanted to cuddle with the guy. But earlier, she had claimed Brian had forced her into the bathroom. Justin pointed out that Kenesha had reached out to Brian herself, meaning she wasn't afraid of him. He never attacked her. 11 years ago, she had simply gotten upset with a boy she liked. Only Kenesha could now help Brian reclaim his life. Kenesha began to break down, yelling that her own life had also been ruined. Her mother returned and pulled her out of the room. Brian's mother approached Raphael and pleaded with him not to give up. Her son had been treated unfairly, and he deserved to be exonerated. Brian had lost 11 years that could never be recovered. He had lost his scholarship, his career, his future. Justin offered a way to fix it, today. The judge gave the floor to the prosecution, and finally, after a long, agonizing 11 years, Brian was exonerated. He broke down in tears, as did his mother. Reporters welcomed Brian as a true hero. He didn't want to sue anyone. All he ever wanted was freedom. Brian cut off the strap of his electronic ankle monitor and thanked his parole officer. His old coach immediately called him and invited him to attend the tryouts. But those 11 years without playing had taken their toll. That year, Brian didn't make it onto any NFL team. However, he didn't give up and continued to train, and a year later, he finally began his professional career. At age 28, Justin Brooks had helped exonerate 27 wrongly convicted individuals. He never charged anyone for his services. That's where the film ends. Thank you for watching until the end.